we have the final speaker of the day, Pete Hughes, who will be talking about relationships between sensory processing and autistic communication. Over to you, Pete.
Thanks, Michael. Right, there we go. So I'm Pete from Leeds Autism Services. I have worked there for a long time, 20 odd years, and I suppose that puts me in quite a unique position because I've been involved directly with supporting over 100 autistic people and their families. And today I'll be talking about autism, sensory processing and communication. I'm not going to apologise because apparently it's not a good thing to do when you start a speech, but I have been here all day and talking to people, so if I'm a bit croaky, that's why. Anyway, let's get started. So, one of my favourite autism quotes: autism's not a processing error, it's a different operating system. And I think that's really relevant to what I'm talking about today, because often autistic communication is seen as the autistic person's problem, and it's not at all. Autistic people are often labelled as having communication difficulties, but I don't think that's really fair. I've met a lot of autistic brilliant communicators over the course of my career, but the issue seems to be that they're often misunderstood by the neurotypical population, which often makes up the majority. And when I talk about meeting autistic people who are great communicators, I include people who have very limited verbal communication or don't use verbal communication at all. But once we learn to speak that language of communication, that individual's communication method, people can really flourish. So I'm going to start off by looking at the senses. So in schools we're still taught that there are 5 senses. We understand that there are actually a lot more. So when people start a placement with us at Leeds Autism Services, we do a sensory assessment, and in that we include vestibular, which is the sense of balance, interoception, which is things like feeling hungry, thirsty, needing the toilet, or even feeling ill, and proprioception, which is spatial awareness, sense of movement, push and pull, and things like that. Now, this presentation is audio-visual, obviously, but it's important to bear in mind that what I'll be talking about affects all the senses, and sensory processing differences are often described as a feature of autism, but as time has gone on in my career, I am becoming more and more convinced that autism is sensory processing differences. So, to bear in mind that our whole perception of the world is completely directed by our sensory experience, and we know no other. It's very difficult to understand what someone else's sensory experience is or what ours is in comparison to other people. And sensory integration gives us the ability to analyse, store and process sensory information. In non-autistic people or neurotypical people, sensory integration occurs without conscious thought or effort. It involves taking in information through our internal and external senses before our brains organise, act upon and store this information. So I'll talk a bit about sensory regulation. So autistic people, as some of you may be aware, may experience more or less sensory stimuli at any given time and then have to process this on a much more conscious level than the neurotypical counterparts. Things to bear in mind are that this takes a lot more cognitive energy and mental effort. People can also have simultaneous hyper and hypo sensitivities on any given sense. So that can be quite hard to wrap your head around, but some examples, some people might be really intolerant of light touch, but crave deep touch. Some people might be intolerant of very high-pitched sound, but crave sort of bassy, low sound. Some people might be intolerant of some colours, but really like others. And fluctuations can occur on depending on mood, stress, and, things like medication, epilepsy as well. But this is the same for everyone, whether they're autistic or neurotypical. So, does anyone drive a car here? So a few hands up then. Anyone who drives a car, tootling along with your car stereo on, you're not sure where you're going and feel a bit lost, or you need to get into a tight parking space, first thing you're going to do is turn the radio down or off, because it helps you see better. Or any of us who've got kids, if we've had a really busy day, we're really stressed and they're making a load of noise and playing up and things, we are going to be less tolerant to that sensory input. So, to talk a bit about perception, and this is where it starts to link in with communication. So, neurotypical brains, as we understand them, perceive objects in their entirety before perceiving their individual parts. What this does is help people make sense of the world, shields them from chaos. Neurotypical brains do this by finding patterns in the absence of information rather than the information itself, and this happens on a really subconscious level. So what neurotypical brains do is filter out loads and loads of the sensory stimuli that's happening around them, and that helps them make sense of the world. So to illustrate this is a visual illustration. But if I ask what people think that is, most people will say a dog, specifically a Dalmatian. It isn't actually a dog. It's a lot of blobs on a white background, but people will tend to use the absence of information mixed with the information itself and perceive a dog. And to break that down even further and take the context out, that's the dog's face. Looks absolutely nothing like a dog's face. That's the dog's tail. Looks nothing like a dog's tail. And that's the dog's hind leg, which again looks nothing like a part of the dog, unless you see it as a whole with the white background, the absence of information. As any autistic person will tell you, when the brain doesn't filter out irrelevant stimuli, it can make the world feel very intense and overwhelming. And the vast influx of sensory stimuli means that the autistic brain has less capacity to identify patterns in the absence of information and work out how to respond. And I spoke a bit earlier about sensory hyposensitivity, which is where people experience less sensory stimuli on any given sense. I think that may be because another sense is hypersensitive and almost taking attention away from that sense. And social communication works in much the same way, in that neurotypical brains tend to use the absence of information to communicate. So people will say things, neurotypical people will say things by not saying them. And other neurotypical people will understand what hasn't been said. So I've got a few examples here. So when someone says, "You left the light on again," what they actually usually mean is, "I'd like to turn it off in future. It wastes electricity and it costs us more money." But people just tend to say, "You left the light on again." Gesture, people might roll their eyes and repeatedly tip their head back towards someone, like that kind of style. My wife tells me that this means, "I'd like you to have a look at what that person is doing, but be subtle about it and try not to let them see you looking." Which is quite a lot to say without using any words. When we look at visual communication, the same applies. So we're all familiar with this sign, no mobile phones. It doesn't really literally mean no mobile phones. It usually means that you're not to take calls, keep the phone on silent, or turn the device off rather than being an outright ban. Placement of signage can also be important, because does this sign apply to the room that you're in or to the whole building? Now usually, if a sign like this is placed at the front of a building on the front entrance, it means throughout the whole building. If it's placed on an internal door, it means just in that room. But that isn't written down anywhere. Nobody actually tells you that or says it outright. People are just expected to understand it. Tone of voice is another one. "Oh, that's brilliant, that is." Or, "Oh, that's brilliant, that is." That phrase could mean, "This is fantastic," or "A really terrible thing just happened." Concept of time. "The bus will be here soon." But how soon is soon? Are we talking about the next 10 minutes or thinking in universal timescales? So again, a lot there is left unsaid. I use this chap when I go out and do autism training workshops. If you ever come to one of them, please don't spoil it for us, but I always ask the group how this person feels, and without fail they start off with depressed, sad, miserable, upset, and before you know it the group's moved to proud, to probably holding a baby. He looks very happy and emotional, so he's gone from one extreme straight to another. The guy's chopping onions. I think the point of that is that our social behaviour often looks the same, but it's the social context and being able to recognise that lets us understand what that behaviour means and how to respond to it. So context is really important. So when I talk about reading between the lines and the gaps between the lines and the absence of information, that really is around social context and being able to understand, recognise and respond to social context, which is often missing from communication. So I've got a few tips to help neurotypical people overcome their communication difficulties. I have been a bit cheeky and tongue-in-cheek with this one. I know what I've done. And I'm a big believer in neurodiversity, and to be fair to neurotypical people, neurotypical brains work in the way that they do. People can't help it. The same can be said for autistic people. But I thought I'd put that in because it's always the autistic person who has to change and adapt to try and make their communication neurotypical. However, hopefully these will give you something to reflect on, especially the neurotypicals in the audience. So, expressive communication. Honesty really is the best policy, and this can be really difficult. It's a skill. Neurotypical communication often relies on not saying things so we don't hurt people's feelings. That does not work well for a lot of autistic people. Uncertainty is a massive cause of anxiety. I've had situations with people where families have tried to shield people from information that the person is going to find upsetting. My thinking is that it's actually a human right to be upset. It's okay to be upset. It's part of life to be upset, and we learn from it. So we shouldn't be taking that away from people. And, it's okay to be honest with people, so say what you mean. Be clear and direct and use consistent language. Neurotypical people can sometimes struggle with being clear and direct in the language because they feel that it's being blunt or it's being rude, but autistic and neurodivergent people can sometimes really benefit from just a straightforward use of language. And when I say use consistent language, one of the things that we're taught about communication is that if someone doesn't pick up on something first time, then we should paraphrase it and say it a different way. And that can be really difficult for autistic people, because it's, why have they said it a different way? Does that mean something else? Does it mean the same thing? So using consistent language can be really helpful. Use bullet points. I've put spoken and written. So for some people, it can be useful to deliver different concepts in communication one step at a time. So instead of going and saying, get your coat, get your bag, get your shoes, get out the door, try breaking them down into single concepts so you're not overloading people with communication. I've put written communication in there as well because it can be really helpful if you've had a conversation with someone who's autistic and you've imparted some really important information to them, to actually feed that back to them as just a few written down bullet points, because people can process it afterwards. Verbal communication is really fleeting, and when you're having, to process a lot of sensory information at once, retaining and keeping hold of that information can be really difficult. So backing it up with a few bullet points can be super helpful. Provide reasons and explanations for things. how neurotypical brains work is that they will identify the social context and then they will work out the reason someone's been given a piece of information or asked to do something. Autistic people might struggle to do that at times. So if you're trying to sort of get someone to do something or say someone should do something, explain and give people a reason why, because otherwise they might not have the information they need to make a good decision. Think about if information is accessible. AIM, Leeds Autism AIM on their website have got a really good booklet about producing accessible information. But if you're using written information, think about, is it accessible? Are your fonts clear? Are your font sizes clear? Are your illustrations necessary? And try and keep it very clear and low arousal. And check yourself for irony, metaphor and sarcasm. Now, I've always worked with autistic adults, and by adulthood, a lot of autistic people have developed a good understanding of irony, metaphor and sarcasm, but it might need to be pointed out. It's a bit like Facebook or other social media. There are other social media platforms available where it's written, people find sarcasm difficult to grasp, so we might have to put an emoji on or say something. Likewise, if you use an irony, metaphor or sarcasm, you might be best off saying that I'm just being sarcastic. And if you're imparting important information, consider the environment, consider the person's sensory input and what they're having to deal with, and try and reduce distractions where you can. And also, very importantly, give people time to process rather than repeating and overloading people with instructions. So, understanding. It's always worth thinking about if verbal communication is actually the person's favoured approach. I think if people use verbal communication, there is an assumption that that's their favourite approach for taking new information on board, but that's not always the way. And with the technology that we've got at our hands these days, it's really easy, and people are used to using sort of text-based and picture-based approaches. If the person is able to tell you what their favourite approach is, ask and listen. Ask the questions in the right way. So don't expect an autistic person to know what you want to know and tell you in advance, because that actually takes quite a lot of cognitive effort and, you know, working out social context and things. So if you're after specific information, don't be afraid to ask. This is another one that flies in the face of a lot of communication training, but avoid open questioning. Again, when we're trained in how to communicate, if anyone's ever had any communication training, it's always use open questioning, don't lead the conversation. That can be really difficult for some autistic people to navigate, and sometimes it's much easier to provide options where possible. One of my colleagues has got a great story about this. She's autistic, her son's autistic, and she asked him what he wanted to do today in the car one day, in the middle of July, and his answer was Christmas. And she said, "We're not doing Christmas." And he was very upset that they weren't going to do Christmas. Because how are you going to know when you're faced with an open question? So if you can provide options for an answer, and it is possible to do that without leading the conversation or giving people the answers. Check understanding by observing and behaviour. I'm sure this is not true for all autistic people because I don't believe in stereotypes, but most autistic people want to do the right thing. So if there's an issue in work or where someone's been supported or in the family home, and you're asking someone to do something or to behave in a particular way and they're not doing it, the chances are that they haven't understood the reason that you're asking. So if people aren't kind of responding well to things, it's probably a communication issue. and be prepared to make mistakes and own them. Sorry is a really powerful word. And if you do get it wrong with an autistic person who you're supporting, own the mistake, say sorry, and most importantly, learn from it, because we'll learn so much more from our mistakes than we do our successes. We did have a situation one day where someone had to get the paramedics called out to them at Leeds Autism Services, and the paramedic used a trigger word completely by accident. The person we were supporting got very upset with that. All he wanted to hear was the word sorry, and the paramedic just would not say sorry. I haven't done anything wrong. I didn't mean to upset him. I'm not saying sorry. And we weren't saying that the paramedic had said anything. There's no way that they could have known what this trigger word was. But you know, you've upset someone. There's nothing wrong with saying sorry. And be reflective on your approaches. If you are neurotypical and supporting autistic people, again, learn from your mistakes, but learn from your successes as well. Very important one. I'm probably preaching to the converted here, being as you're here today, but really importantly, and one of the big reasons we do what we've done today with this event, listen to autistic voices. That's probably the most important thing we can do to learn about how to support autistic people in their communication. And finally, seek help if you need it, whether you're a professional, a family, a carer, someone providing support, an employer. There's nothing wrong with seeking help, and you will probably learn from it. And finally, just to get this in here, using autism-friendly approaches to communication is really unlikely to put anybody at a disadvantage. And I think sometimes there's a bit of reticence to do it. Now, people who you're coming into contact with may not have a diagnosis, they might not be seeking diagnosis or even recognise that they're autistic or neurodivergent themselves. But if you're communicating with someone and that mode of communication isn't working, try a different approach. And you try an autism-friendly approach and it might just work, because autism-friendly approaches work for all sorts of other people too. They're good for people with ADHD, trauma, anxiety, even things like dementia. And if that person is neurotypical, it really is unlikely to put them at a disadvantage. Did I whiz through that? Oh, I've not done bad. Thank you.